The Ghost in the Mirror by John Bellairs. Chapter 1. For 7 nights in a row, Mrs. Zimmerman had seen weird things in her front parlor. Each night around 12, she would wake up and go downstairs to watch the strange lights that played on her walls and ceiling. Sometimes she saw eerie pictures on the blank wall in the passageway outside the pantry. Once she saw a sad little girl who seemed to be beckoning to her. Other times she saw smiling faces in a graveyard at night. But each time she had stared hard for a while. But each time after she had stared hard for a while, the pictures would vanish. Mrs. Zimmerman hardly knew what to think of all this. Perhaps it was some leftover magic of her own, because after all, she was a witch. Not an evil witch with a broomstick and a hoarse laugh, but a friendly, wrinkly-faced witch with a mop of disorderly gray hair. And she was a witch who loved the color purple instead of black, which was what witches were supposed to wear. A lot of things in Mrs. Zimmerman's house were purple: the china clock, the wallpaper, the rugs, the soap in the bathroom, and most of Mrs. Zimmerman's dresses. Her witchery was the kindly and eccentric sort, which was why she really didn't feel that the lights in the parlor and the pictures on the wall belonged to her. A few of them seemed sinister somehow, dark and threatening. Still, maybe they were a reflection of her present state of mood, which was not very cheerful. The year was 1951. Though Mrs. Zimmerman was only 64, lately there had been times when she felt 102. Being lonely didn't help. Her best friend, Jonathan Barnevelt, who lived in a Victorian mansion next door, was away for the summer. He and his nephew Louis were in Europe seeing the sights. Jonathan was a wizard, and he and Mrs. Zimmerman had lots in common. Mrs. Zimmerman could have gone with them, but she had just not felt like it. Perhaps she would have if Rosarita Pottinger, Louis's best friend, had taken the trip as she had planned. However, Rosarita had broken her ankle in June, so she was forced to stay home. Mrs. Zimmerman knew how disappointed Rosarita was about missing the trip, and she simply did not have the heart to go and leave Rosarita behind in the town of New Zebedee, Michigan. Despite her injury, Rosarita did show up at Mrs. Zimmerman's house a lot. Her father drove her, and she would hobble in to play chess and backgammon and talk about this and that. Mrs. Zimmerman was grateful for the company, but still she felt depressed. Depressed and anxious, like someone who was waiting for something awful to happen. What was she waiting for? She would have given a lot to know. On the 8th evening after the visions began, Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosarita were sitting in Mrs. Zimmerman's kitchen discussing the odd things that had been happening. Rosarita was 14, and she was tall and gawky. She wore glasses, and her hair was black and stringy. Since she was staying the night, she was wearing her rose-pink pajamas and bathrobe, and every now and then she would reach down, trying to scratch an itch on her ankle with the cast on it. Mrs. Zimmerman was wrapped in her purple flowered bathrobe, and she had just lit a cigar in the usual way by snapping a match out of thin air. A long, leisurely trail of smoke drifted toward the open window. The lined curtains stirred in the night breeze, and moths and other insects fluttered on the screen. So what do you think it all means, Mrs. Zimmerman? Asked Rosarita with a worried frown. Is there a ghost loose in your house, or what? Mrs. Zimmerman waited a long time before answering. Not a ghost exactly, she said, but I do feel that someone is trying to contact me, and I think I know who that someone may be. Rosarita tried again to reach an itchy spot under the cast. It was really driving her crazy tonight. Who is it? She asked. I think it may be Granny Weatherby. This feels like her kind of magic. Rosarita looked puzzled. Granny Weatherby? Who's she? Mrs. Zimmerman sighed. Well, I don't mention her much, but she taught me most of what I know about magic. It's true that I have a Doctor of Magic Arts degree from the University of Göttingen in Germany, but that was just the frosting on the cake. The real magic that I know I learned from Granny. She was the one who showed me how to find my own powers and how to use them. She was not my real grandmother, but an old woman I met when I was about your age. Of course, Granny Weatherby is long dead, but for some reason she seems to need to contact me. Why? It seemed like a simplistic question to ask, but Rosarita had learned that when magic was involved, sometimes the most obvious questions brought the most interesting answers, so she asked it anyway. Why indeed, muttered Mrs. Zimmerman. Maybe she wants to restore my magic powers. Rosarita made a face. If only she could. Then you could do something about this itchy old cast. Mrs. Zimmerman gave Rosarita a sympathetic smile. I wish I could help, but as you know very well, my powers were just about wiped out in the battle I had with the evil spirit 18 months ago. Rosarita began to shiver a little. She remembered the battle all right. Sometimes she still had nightmares about it. But she knew that even without her magic, Mrs. Zimmerman was probably the last person in the world to give up in despair or gloom. "Would you be happier if you could be a witch again?" Rosarita asked. "I mean a real witch and not just one who can pull lighted matches out of the air?" Mrs. Zimmerman said thoughtfully, "Maybe so. Oh, when I lost most of my magic, I thought it wouldn't be so bad. For a while, I even managed to convince myself that I was happy, but I have to admit that I haven't been very happy for nearly a whole year now." "But you do the things you always did. You play cards with Louis and his Uncle Jonathan and me, and you bake wonderful chocolate chip cookies, and you're one of my best friends." With a smile, Mrs. Zimmerman said, "I know I really have no right to complain, but I just have the feeling that something is wrong somehow. Maybe my life would be better if I had those old powers back. Maybe I'd be more cheerful and optimistic. I had my magic for almost 50 years, which is most of my life. Now that it's gone, somehow I don't know how to live properly anymore. Anyway, if those lights and pictures really are from Granny, I'd like to know more about them." Rosarita had a troubled look. Since she had met Mrs. Zimmerman and Jonathan Barnabelt 2 years ago, she had seen lots of magic, and some of it was nasty and wicked. She traced patterns on the tabletop with her finger, and then finally she spoke. "I like you the way you are, Mrs. Zimmerman," she said suddenly, "and I don't think you should mess around with things that you don't understand. What if it isn't Granny Who's trying to get in contact with you? What if it's somebody evil? You told me how hard it is sometimes to tell good magic from evil. You should be careful." Mrs. Zimmerman stared for a second, then she laughed. "Oh, good heavens, Rosarita," she exclaimed. "You always say what's on your mind, don't you? But don't you worry. I'm old enough to be your grandmother, and I've seen a lot of things in my life that you haven't. No, I can't believe that the lights and pictures are evil. They may be, spooky and gloomy and even scary, but they don't seem to aim any evil my way. Anyway, I have a feeling in the pit of my stomach that it's Granny who is trying to contact me." "But you said the images are scary," Rosarita said stubbornly. "Well, I didn't mean to call them scary exactly. They don't frighten me at all. Oh, it's true that there's something sad about those lights and pictures, but then Granny was a pretty sour old woman. Do not worry about me, Rosarita. I just have to wait for her to show herself to me more fully. Then I'll know what it is that I'm supposed to do." Rosarita still looked doubtful, but she knew that there was no point in trying to argue with Mrs. Zimmerman. She was a very stubborn person, and when she thought she was right, you couldn't budge her. Mrs. Zimmerman talked on about Granny Weatherby's earth magic, her herbs and roots and divining rods. Meanwhile, Rosarita stared at the reflection of the overhead lamp in the dark pool of cocoa in her cup. The reflection made her think of a fantastic lighted spaceship hurtling toward a black void. Before she knew it, she was nodding and dreaming about outer space, flying saucers and little green men. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Zimmerman's exclamation brought Rosarita awake again. "Just look at the time," Mrs. Zimmerman said. "We should have been in bed hours ago. I'll clear the table. You go brush your teeth." Still feeling very drowsy, Rosarita hobbled into the bathroom, where everything was purple, from the medicine cabinet to the toilet paper. She heard Mrs. Zimmerman clattering about the kitchen. As she brushed her teeth, Rosarita studied her reflection in the purple-framed mirror. She was a skinny, homely girl, she thought. She still wore jeans and sweatshirts and sneakers most of the time, but sometimes now she felt like dressing up. There were times when she wished she were prettier, and there were other times when she was perfectly satisfied being just who she was. Tonight she could not quite make up her mind, but she did notice that her reflection looked just as sleepy as she felt. Since the cast on her ankle made climbing stairs difficult, Rosarita was staying in a downstairs bedroom instead of the upstairs guest room. It was a cozy bedroom next door to the dining room, with a neat little single bed covered with a comforter embroidered with bouquets of violets. On the wall over the bed was a painting of purple water lilies, signed by the French painter Monet. He had given the painting to Mrs. Zimmerman during her visit to France in 1913. Rosarita just slipped into bed when Mrs. Zimmerman looked in to make sure she was all right. Rosarita murmured a quiet "good night," and she heard Mrs. Zimmerman climb the stairs to her own bedroom. A second later, Rosarita was sound asleep, but upstairs in her bedroom, Mrs. Zimmerman lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The luminous hands of the West clock alarm beside the bed told her it was almost 12. Mrs. Zimmerman glanced at them from time to time as she lay thinking. She waited until midnight, then swung herself out of bed. She put on her bathrobe and slippers and padded downstairs to the living room. What she saw made her catch her breath. The flashing lights had never been as bright as they were tonight, and this time they seemed to be coming from an old mirror that hung over a bookcase on one wall. The mirror had a mahogany frame and had never seemed magical, not until now, but it was shooting red and green and white flashes in all directions, and as Mrs. Zimmerman drew close, she saw a shape floating under the shimmering surface of the glass. It might have been a pale moon or a huge egg or a pinkish plate, but it was none of those things. It was a face. Mrs. Zimmerman stared wide-eyed. At first, the face was vague and blurred, like something glimpsed at night through a rain-spattered window. The lights flickering over it made it hard to see, but then it got clearer, and Mrs. Zimmerman could tell that it was Granny Weatherby's face. Granny Weatherby looked just the way Mrs. Zimmerman remembered from childhood. She had a little wrinkled apple of a face, all lines and hollows. Her cheeks were pink and her pale lips were turned down. Under wispy white eyebrows, her black eyes shone brightly from deep sockets, and her mouth was moving. Inside her brain, Mrs. Zimmerman heard Granny's cracked, familiar voice. "Well, Florrie, it's been a long time." Granny Weatherwax was the only one who ever called Mrs. Zimmerman that. She was always Florence to her family, Mrs. Zimmerman to Rose, Rita, and Louis, and Frizzywig and Pruny Face, and similar nicknames to Jonathan. But Granny Weatherby had never called her anything but Florrie. The old voice went on. "Listen to me, Florrie, dear. Listen very, very carefully." The dead woman spoke for some time, telling her friend what she had to do to get her old magic powers back. Mrs. Zimmerman listened and smiled and nodded. Granny Weatherby's voice went on and on and on, and Mrs. Zimmerman heard it as it echoed in her mind. After some minutes had passed by in this way, the mirror went dark and the flashing lights died. Mrs. Zimmerman trembled a little and blinked. She stood in the darkened living room and felt as if she had just come out of a dream. Without bothering to turn on the lights, she walked out of the room and began to climb the stairs. She yawned and felt half asleep, but a dreamy smile was on her face. At last she had the answer to her prayers. Her life would be renewed. And that is the end of chapter 1.